All right, everybody, welcome back to a commentary on culture. Today, we're going to be, well, I guess before I really get into today or what we're going to do today, happy Father's Day. So, this is an episode dedicated expressly to being a good father and talking about what happens if you're a piece of shit father. Um, and fuck all the women out there who try to make it about Single Mom Awareness Day or something and Juneteenth. Today is about dads. So there you go, dads. Um, which Juneteenth is just hilarious because it's like, I don't know. So it's supposed to represent the end of slavery in America, except not really because the natives got to keep their slaves. So really, it's just about when white people were not even white people, right? It's white with the special white people, the special tribe of white people when they lost their slaves, and I don't know. Basically, it just boils down to an anti-white holiday, and they put it right on Father's Day so that it's supposed to, usurp the role of the father in the family, and there is a racial component to that because the family in the black community has been absolutely wiped out. So, but I mean, I don't know. Not a lot of positives there to really take away from that. It's just comical, It's like this stuff is just so, you know, obscenely disconnected from reality. It's just like it's hard to take it seriously. That's how dumb it is. And like the question of whether or not we should celebrate the end of slavery, it's like, well, why would we celebrate, I mean, we ended child, employment in factories, are we going to celebrate that too with a national day off? No. We as things got better, in the world, right? As our standards of living improved, we got rid of the parts and pieces of our culture that we didn't like, and that was one of them. So, I mean, does it need to be recognized by a national holiday? No, because the intent isn't to recognize, the accomplishments of white people in removing slavery. It's meant to denigrate us as a race and as a culture, and break down, continue to break down Western civilization, and pretty much hold over our heads, the imperfections of the past by our modern standards, right? So, I mean, just, you know, obscene, right? Just dumb. But that actually doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about today at all. So, moving on, right? So we're going to talk about a couple things. Actually, we're just probably going to talk about one because I think it's going to take about an hour, and I really don't want to. I was thinking about trying to make it like a two-subject podcast, but like that's just a lot, and I think most people only want to listen to it for an hour or so, So we'll just leave it at that. Um, so, unlike usual, where I kind of break down something that was written, and it's typically a very positive message. Today, um, or, the news stories and stuff from last time. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to bring it up in a little bit different way. So, we're going to be listening to excerpts from a podcast by Amara Maple, or featuring Amara Maple. Um, it's the name of the show is called Three Girls, One Kitchen. And the episode itself was called The Dark Side of Porn, featuring Amara Maple. And Amara Maple is not actually the name that, well, how do I put this? So, Amara Maple was the most successful porn star for a while, right? She had an 8-month career shooting extremely hardcore pornography. She was married at the time, and she wanted kids, and she's going to talk about that a little bit in some of the little clips that we're looking at. And now she's divorced and trying to get the many videos of her performances pulled off the internet while also advocating against, hardcore, basically big name pornography, right? So you probably know her name is Lana Rhoades, but her actual name is Amara Maple. So basically, she kind of opens up a little bit about some of the effects that she's dealing with after this stuff, and it's not like a sympathy, we're not listening for sympathy, right? Because like, she did this herself, and she deserves the hell that she's created. But I guess the other thing to take away from what we're about to listen to is that like she's not like a beacon of where to be, she's not like a not a person to listen to, right? But there was some educational stuff to take away from what she and her compatriots on the podcast were talking about, right? And it's important to put that in there because she still advocates for what they call ethical porn, which is hilarious, right? And she pushes the disastrous idea of dating and casual sex culture and masturbation and sex toys and like all this other stuff. Like the episode itself is actually sponsored by Adam and Eve. So just to give you a little bit of a perspective on like she's still very much in the depths of this hell, right? It's very toxic lifestyle, but there is a little bit of truth that comes from her testimony that is very positive for people like us, right, that are trying to kind of rebuild what's been absolutely destroyed. So, the first clip is going to talk about structure, right, family structure, emotional structure, stuff like that, and how it ties into morality and a willingness to accept and entertain these ideas, right? So we'll go ahead and we'll listen to that now. Oh, hey, where'd my mouse go? There we go. All right.
I've even had just here in LA, when I was like 21-ish, I just was meeting with people for like job interviews or whatever, and I've had guys try to take advantage, and I've actually had someone tell me that like you won't get anywhere in Hollywood or in LA without sleeping with people. I've had like high up business like men, company owners say that, and they tell girls that. Luckily, like I went home to my boyfriend and I was like, listen to what this guy just said. Obviously wasn't down,
Yeah.
but a lot of girls actually believe that they won't be somebody or won't be able to be successful without sleeping with people and doing these certain things. Because guys, or even girls, whoever, people of power manipulate and tell people, like, you have to do this.
Well, it's great that you had someone to go back to help give you that reassurance that the decision that you made was right. That's kind of the drawback to being young and naive, is that, like Olivia mentioned, a lot of these girls who are getting into the sex industry, whether it be porn or prostitution or even just, posting nudes online and doing OnlyFans, is that, like she mentioned, they come from homes that are not necessarily broken, but just don't have guidance, or there's abuse going on, or there's chaos inside of the home.
Okay, so I kind of cut that one off because the rest of her story was kind of long-winded. But so the first takeaway here is that guidance and structure from the family, right, specifically from the masculine elements of the family, like men, serve as boundaries for the morality of young women. So Amara or Lana or whatever you want to call her, right? She continues to explain that she had a very chaotic childhood due to her parents and her mentally ill sister, and that really prevented her from having the structure necessary, that would stop her from, making that poor decision to join the porn industry later on down the road, right? And that's kind of a big deal because, we'll talk about this here in a second, but, so when the first chick was talking, she's talking about, her, she had her boyfriend to lean on, right, to kind of talk her out of that, like it wasn't like, her boyfriend was like a positive influence, like it's not like a strong influence, it's a very eroded relationship, right? So I mean, the amount of effort that it takes to dissuade young women, and young men too, right? But in this case, we're talking about young women that didn't have, those fatherly role models, from exploring these destructive lifestyles, right, is so incredibly small, right? Like in real terms, all it really took was, someone of importance in her life, kind of looking at her and going, why would you do that? Like, no, don't do that. It's such a simple exchange, right? And as long as the proper structure and family hierarchy are already there, it's not like a really big fight, right? And I mean, yeah, is just it's not that big of a deal, right? It just takes so little effort. All it really takes is that spine, right, to be willing to have someone be upset at you for a little bit, right? And that's really what a lot of men really lack, right? That's what we've really kind of abandoned. We've been taught to run things, or to search for this approval constantly, right? To where everything always has to be a positive, happy experience, and you're incapable of dealing with the other person being unhappy, right? And the extent of that is that your daughter is willing to sell herself, right, for really really nothing, right? So this chick was like the number one porn star in the world. And it's not like she's a millionaire. She's not loaded from it. Maybe she kept a little bit of money from that, but like it really wasn't that like extremely life changing. And it's it's just a negative situation. I mean, but the point is that, it would have taken so little effort for someone to sit there and just tolerate her being upset, just to say, no, don't do that, right? And that would have changed the game. And the second thing to take away from here, right, this is just kind of an underlying theme that's kind of tied into a lot of other stuff that I've talked about a little bit, but like, the people that are talking in the podcast just, they're not even on the same playing field, right? They're just out to lunch on this. So, the value of the woman in the workplace is still proportional to her value on the sexual marketplace, right? And that's kind of what she was talking about with, people talking about, well, in order to do this, in order to be successful anywhere, you have to sell yourself, and so in that case, it's very explicit and it's very extreme, but how many times have you heard someone who's a waitress say that, oh, well, I flirt with the drunk customers, right? So I can bring home a bigger tip, right? It's kind of the same thing. You're marketing your sexual value, right? And, that's kind of a strong, a strong topic, right? That's a that's a pretty big pill to swallow, right? Because the reality is, once you accept that, it's like, well, if they were more valuable or had the same value, the executives wouldn't risk alienating them for their personal ends, right? This is kind of the inverse of men, right? Who have their personal moral failures excused, in exchange for workplace values, such as when, football players keep their jobs after committing horrible, violent crimes against their own families. And it's when I say the inverse is true, obviously, there's plenty of, there's a lot of, instances of women also keeping their jobs despite doing bad things. But, it's not really, I'll put it this way. It's, generally speaking, right, in very broad terms, it's not as related to their personal conduct outside of work. It's generally related to their work failures, right? That sexual value is making up for their lack of workplace value, right? And that's kind of an important thing to realize, is that by monetizing, right, and, converting that sexual value into financial value, it's a complete destruction of, that the specialness, right? Like you've put a price tag on it, right? So now anybody can pay that price and have access to that level of intimacy. So, but that'll come up a little bit later. We'll kind of continue on here and listen to the second clip. So, which, this directly ties into what we're about to listen to.
This is where it really shows how naive I was, because when I first got into porn, I had no idea that I was going to have to suck dick or have sex, which sounds so weird because that you're going to suck dick or have sex, but it didn't register, it didn't process. I really didn't think about the acts that I was going to have to do to become a porn
well, you think
star.
Of consequences either, because you just thought of the glamour of it, like you said.
Yeah, it was all glamorized in my head. It was all, oh, I'm going to be this and I'm going to be that, but it was never, I have to do this to get there. And I think it's hard for the young mind to see that. And then there's also the issue of being young and naive and not knowing how to say no in certain situations. And luckily speaking back on your experiences, you clearly were raised right, or, had the confidence to say no, and you had someone to go back on to help reassure you that you made the right decisions.
Yeah, because as long, like...
Okay, so basically, the underlying theme here is that women are emotional and are vulnerable to carefully curated images of success, right? They're especially vulnerable to the propaganda, and that's because of their innate nature, right? That we're going to talk about in a sec. So, I mean, this is kind of an extreme example, right? Because she's talking about being basically conned into, hardcore pornography, right? But it's becoming more and more common, right, with the widespread success of user upload pornography sites like OnlyFans. And the proliferation of feminist propaganda, right? That elevates sexual liberation, which has been around for a while, but now it's getting to a point where it's extreme. It is, and it's by the standards that were in place even at the time of a lot of this third wave feminism. It's pushing the boundaries of um, I mean, what, nothing is sacred, right? These people are taking everything. So, it's kind of pushing the boundaries of that, right? So it extends beyond pornography, though, and it influences women across the entire economy to basically destroy their prospects of having a stable family. And instead, they're pursuing these hollow career goals, right, for no reason other than, they were basically influenced by these, trendy videos and slogans, about like, human evolution, right? Oh, it's 2021, and like, oh, break the glass ceiling, this, that, and the other. It's that one dimensional reasoning, right, that led to, these poor women to assume that, their lives would be fulfilled with these material goods, right? If they monetize their sexual influences, um, and, monetize their familial attributes, right, while suppressing the family itself, in pursuit of the same material and social goals, right? So, basically, I mean, they're converting, their innate gifts, that were never I don't want to say profitable, right? But they weren't marketed. They were considered valuable, to a man who was profitable in the society, and now they're being monetized, and it's sad because it's like they're basically exploiting themselves, away from what would really fulfill them, because they've been propagandized into it, and this kind of so we kind of talked about this first too. The reason for this is directly kind of linked to those innate abilities, right? It's not like they're defective. This is part of it. They have a natural ability to be distributive, right, to the needs of the family. They take their perspective is to to basically have well, to distribute it, right? So what she was talking about was she wanted to live this lifestyle, right? And that was basically her excellent opportunity to have stuff to distribute, and what she didn't consider was actually how to get there, right? So, and that's kind of the masculine side of it, right? Because the man's natural inclination is to understand how it works, the building blocks to get there, right? So they've circumvented that. They've completely jumped that, short circuited it, right, and completely jumped that element, that safeguard, right, that was meant to stop things like that from happening, right? And they've gone right to the ends, and that's so this is a feminine trait, right? And you can see it in effeminate men, right? They don't consider the hard work that's necessary to be successful. They jump right into pretending to be successful, right? And the end goals that come from that. They don't want to have, the industry that makes them rich. They want to have the private jets and the hoes and stuff like that, right? And that is, ultimately a feminine trait, and this is exactly the other side of it, properly used, that's a distributive element to the family. So, basically, right, so, they circumvented that, and, it's the limit of the female ability to be masculine, because they're putting themselves out of the job that they're naturally inclined to do, right? They're pushing themselves to be in a position where they're trying to make that that manly alpha assertive decision, right? That command decision of how we are going to have stuff to distribute, right? And the problem is they're doing it from their natural perspective. So in order to do that successfully, they have to literally take themselves, because it's a zero-sum game, right? It's not like you can just remove parts and pieces of yourself, right, and still keep what was there. There's a limited amount of space, right, inside your personality to deal with this stuff. So they have to continue to remove more and more of these feminine elements from their personality right, and adopt these masculine traits, to satisfy, those feminine demands. And in the end, it's basically a lightened version of gender dysphoria, right, is really the end goal of that. And the fact that this gender dysphoria stuff, and the gender studies, and the fact that that's been so prevalent lately and so aggressive is not in a vacuum, right? It's directly linked to this, because it's very real for these women to be like, obviously, you can feel like a man in a woman's body, right? Because I feel like a man in a woman's body, right? Or I feel like I have to be a man in a woman's body. That's not their line of reasoning, right? But they implicitly connect those two, and then they apply it, right? And say, well, if it's this, if it's like this for me, it can be like that, at an extreme level for that person, right? And it's kind of the same in a way. They are loosely connected. And it's I kind of lost my train of thought there, but basically, the point is that it's an extension of this problem, right? Because so they're talking about, earlier in that little clip, right? They were kind of talking about, I read Playboy when I was younger, and I watched Girls Next Door, which are both like super degenerate. Like, why would you let your daughter, have access to this stuff, right? But it's like, those have been around for a while, like Playboy and Girls Next Door. That was like, 60s, 70s, 80s. Playboy, that was, kind of a big thing in the early 60s. And there were elements of pornography that were available before that too. So this stuff has been a long time coming, especially with, this is basically the end product of feminism, right, in the workplace, because they've been doing these masculine roles for such a long time, that, the how do I put this? So every time, in order to meet that basic change, right? So women in a man's workplace, it was traditionally a male job. What they're basically, these follow-on waves of feminism are basically fighting, the natural barriers to that, right? And they're basically slowly over time reinventing themselves, so that they can function as a man in the man's workplace, right? And it's, I don't know if I'm talking too deep here. That might be a little bit too deep to really break down. I didn't really write that down. That wasn't in any of my notes. I'm just kind of coming up with that on the fly. But basically, so as they remove, all right, so now women are allowed in the workplace. Well, women don't want to do the same jobs as men, and they're not as, hardy as men. So, we're not going to pay them this or that, like there's natural boundaries to it, right? That, well, okay, so they're allowed in the workplace, but, we're only going to compensate them for, what they're good at, right? And we don't traditionally value, what, the other person is good at, right? Because, they don't have experience, right? It's really not cut out for them. So we have to take all these special considerations, right? Well, and then they change that, and then, well, like women in the workplace, if you're bringing home the same amount of money, you need to be able to get divorced, and you need to be able to, choose, that masculine role of who are you going to have sex with and when, right? So they had no fault divorce, right? And birth control and Roe versus Wade, and so it just snowballs down, down the hill basically to the point where, and well, I guess so to kind of shortcut this, right, and bring it to its conclusion, it's impossible to fundamentally link these two, right? There's exceptions to every rule, right? And maybe you can deviate from the rule a little bit, but the reality is that, that the longer women are in, the workplace and in that masculine role of provider, they're going to have longer term degenerative effects of it, right? And this is one of them. So kind of continuing on that tangent, right? So now we're going to talk about, we talked about monetizing sex a little bit earlier, right? And they actually kind of address it a little bit. So, but their perspective on it is a little bit, well, I guess it's what you'd expect, right, of young feminists. So that's next.
But, I definitely was pressured into some things that I didn't want to do with men. They had the audacity to ask me to literally go give them a hand job behind the dumpsters. Yeah, and, they were like, oh, I'll give you $100 if you take off your panties for me. And, I was vulnerable. I was young. I was like, oh, like, no harm. Like, okay, like, he just wants my panties. Like, heck yeah, $100. Like,
but
that's
then they're
going to
keep, they're going to be like, how much?
They kept pushing
and
that put me up. And once they, like, put you on the spot, like, it's so hard to, like, say no and you feel so awkward.
All right. So I cut that one off too, because I mean they just get so long winded. It's just like they talk about one thing and it's just like trip, 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 trip. Just shut up. Which I guess I shouldn't say that because I get kind of long winded too about certain things. But damn, I feel like I'm a little bit easier to listen to because we're talking about substance and it's just like this constant loop of, why am I being treated this way? So basically, continuing on from that last point, right, from the earlier clip that we were just listening to, that what they're basically elaborating on is that, they're completely dismissing the structure behind wealth production, right, its generation, and jumping right into having that wealth and value to distribute, but at this point, they've realized that something has gone horribly wrong, and that they're not supposed to be exchanging this much of, that intimate sexuality for money, but they've already started and don't really know where to draw the line, right, and they don't know how to say no. And that's basically because there is no line once you've agreed to the transaction on the basis of sex. In the same way there's no line when you've agreed to the transaction on the basis of labor, right? No one is morally horrified by their boss asking them to take a step farther than they've done before in fulfilling a task, right? That's within the same scope as the job they're already doing. And yet these women are horrified by men who are already paying for their sexual appeal, asking for more, right? So you're what I mean by that, right, is that, when you're at work, right, and your boss, let's say, you're in like construction or something, and well, I guess I shouldn't use that because I've never done construction. So let's say, you're like, I don't know, like working at Lowe's, right, and, we'll use my example, right, I was working in the lumber department, and I was like, like moving stuff around or something, and my boss was like, hey, can you, help, there's a lady down at the cash register, right, that, she just bought a fridge, we know it's not your department, we know it's not your job, but can you like help her, take that to her car? I was like, sure, no problem, right? It's beyond my job description, right? It's beyond what's already part of my job. And, I didn't, it's an escalation, right? Because now I'm in a different department. Now I'm doing something that I'm not, normally supposed to do. Something that I haven't really been trained up to, right? I don't, at the time, right? I guess moving a fridge isn't very hard, but some of the equipment, is just a little bit weird. But the point of, that example is that, it was outside of my job scope, right? And my boss asked me to do it, and I was like, okay, sure. And that's basically what they're talking about, right? But what they don't understand, what like just totally mystifies them is that, that what they're doing is they're monetizing their sexual appeal, right? And, they're basically offended, right? That like someone would have the audacity to be like, okay, well, can you kind of up the ante a little bit? Like I'll pay you for it. If you're already here and you're already going to do that, if you're already here and you're going to move pallets around, can you up the ante a little bit and help this lady take her fridge to her car? It's the same thing. In their mind, it's the same process. And as far as, the actual business exchange goes, it's exactly the same thing, right? So, but the reason that they're horrified, is that there is an intrinsic value to that sexuality. And we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit, right? Because there's another clip that kind of lays that out a little bit deeper. So, but, in this case, the point is that, they don't know how to say no because they've already said yes, right? And it's that logical, moral conflict for them to back out of a deal that they've already agreed to, right? So the lady is talking about working at Hooters. And, I mean, everybody's been to Hooters, right? It's, young, attractive women in, skimpy clothing, right? That are, the whole point is that, they're marketing themselves, right, in their clothing, to, make it kind of a guy's, dive bar kind of a thing. It's sexual appeal for money, right? And, basically she's horrified that someone would ask them to kind of up that deal, right? And it's like, well, she doesn't know how to say no, and it's really hard. And that what they chalk it up to is that, there's a natural, willingness to be agreeable, which is true, but at the same time, there's a logical conflict there because you've already agreed to the deal on those terms, right? So, and this is where it's really important that there's nobody, there's no positive masculine influence in their lives, right? Because they would point out, if there was one, it's really, if anyone were to approach you with this, and you were that rational masculine person, the simple answer here is that, working in a sexualized environment would imply that you're open to being sexual for money, from the get-go, right? So if those are the, those are the terms of the deal, to start with, right? That's the basis of the whole exchange. It's scalable, right? Everything is scalable in the economy. So if you start out by doing that, right? If you start out working a job for labor, at some point in time, somebody is going to ask you, hey, if I compensate you this much for your labor, can you do this, right? That's outside of your outside of your normal thing. And normally, men kind of latch onto that and they're like, hell yeah, dude, I can lift up something super heavy, if you pay me more money, right? I can drive a bigger truck if you pay me more money. I can fly a bigger plane if you pay me more money, right? That's the basis of how the economy works. So the lack of male influence here is really obvious because, basically what's happening is they're on, their limit. With all the propaganda that they've been given, they're at their limit of their ability to act as a male while still retaining their feminine, a semblance of their femininity, right? It's a male's job in the relationship to be confrontational and oriented, outward, right? And a female's job to be oriented inward and naturally inclined to being agreeable, so that way the family keeps functioning, right? Because in a normal family, in the traditional family structure that these thoughts just continually try to denigrate, and get away from, it's counterproductive for members of the family, right? For the women of the family to be confrontational in the house, right? That doesn't help anybody. There's one person who's supposed to be confrontational, and that's the head of the house, right? And the men of the house, they're supposed to be oriented outward, right? And to set those boundaries and say, no, no, I'm not going to drive for 24 hours straight. That's stupid, right? But, because they don't have that, because they're only half of what they should be, right? Because the union of man and women is the total. They're only half, and they're trying to, basically destroy themselves to get the other half, and emulate it, and act it out, right? They've pretty much dug themselves into a hole where they're at the limit, right? And that is the limit. You can't, unless they continue to well, not but to continue to engineer themselves, to be men, mentally and physically and spiritually, right? They're going to continue to run into these problems, and that's pretty much, so their answer to it, isn't to do that, right? Even though, the next generation of feminine women, or feminists, right? Not feminine women, but feminists, right? Will do that and are doing that. That's largely again where the trans movement is coming from. Their answer is, well, we need rules, and we need to, just eject these perverts from society. And it's like, well, you can't, it's just this answer that's just completely off the wall. It's like, all right, yeah, let's just totally, disregard reality, and just break the game, to change, that one rule. It's like the line of logic there just doesn't work, right? It's not transferable, so to speak, So, let's talk about the long-term effects of this, right? And that's so this is kind of the meat and potatoes, right? This was the one where I was like, so someone actually posted this clip to, I think it was like a 4chan board or something, and like someone sent it to me, and so if you listen to the actual podcast, right, it actually gets kind of graphic where, like the whole point of it was talking about how porn is evil because, women get like physically mutilated, right? And so she's talking about, she was watching a video in Europe where like there's somebody like punching into this girl's like asshole. And, it's like, there's clearly, permanent physical damage from that, right? And, as I was watching it, I was like, I mean, as long as, it's hard to argue against some of that. It's like, yeah, like that's repulsive, right? But what does that have to do with me? Especially if you chose to do that stuff, you're being paid to do that. Like there's kind of a natural willingness to be accepting of that, right? Because it's like within the confines, of the game, of our laws of our society, right? The rules that we were brought up with. If you choose to destroy yourself, whatever, right? But and it really doesn't serve a purpose, and we're going to talk about why that's wrong, right? Obviously, like, so as this extends to, millions of other young women, like it doesn't just stay with these, extreme little outliers, right? Now it's part of, a daily conversation, right? Now it's part of, your neighborhood and your family and your friends, and your friends' family and stuff. It's not like, I guess to explain this a little bit better, Lana Rhoades is one person, right? She came from a bad household. It grew up and made a ton of bad decisions. She was a number one porn star for a while. She had an extreme trajectory. She had an extreme experience. But the problem is that, we've applied that, I don't know. I guess maybe I should have included it because that would have been a discussion point, right? That, that as long as, we've allowed this stuff to take place and fester, it's going to continue to show itself, in our community, right? But I decided not to because I wanted to focus more on what led to it, because she talks about that a little bit. So here's kind of the meat and potatoes of this, and we'll kind of explain that, kind of what I was just talking about, and a little bit more here in a sec.
Downside to having done porn, obviously, is the stigma. And that's probably the thing that's hardest for me to live with now is the stigma of having done porn and knowing that I can run, but I can't hide from it no matter where I go. Everyone knows, everyone's seen me get fucked. I just have to do the best that I can with it. And it's like I feel like I have a life sentence over my head at 24. Like, I'm always going to be Lana Rhoades. I'm always going to be a porn star, no matter how bad I don't want to be. And I've shared some of like the issues that I've had. Like, you even met my neighbor. You didn't meet her, but you saw my neighbor in Chicago. When I had a house in Chicago, I was married. I was planning on having kids with my ex-husband. She would harass me because she knew who I was. She would call the police on me, say I was shooting porn at my house.
I was gonna say, didn't you have even this house? They had asked like what you were gonna do here, which I thought was really disrespectful, and I was just like, why? Like, why?
I mean, I can understand why they would ask. However, every time that it's brought up, and I'm just like, I'm Amara Maple right now. It's extremely like hard for me. I'm like, why do I have to be reminded of this all of the time? Even Olivia went on a date the other day, and I went with her, and her date and his friend were asking me porn questions, and it's just like,
I mean, come to find out, they were just disgusting males and had a fetish for porn. And
but even you're obviously pissed because you're like, oh, he was supposed to be my date, but I'm literally wanting to kill myself because I don't want to be fucking reminded of this shit. I don't want to be thought of that way. And I would say, I definitely deal with depression and suicidal thoughts monthly because of my past in porn. And that's just me being really candid. It's not fun. It's not a great thing to have over your head.
Okay. So it's really easy at this point to say, she deserves her suffering and leave it at that, right? Because it's true, right? And that concept, of sin, right, generates, that sin generates long-term torment from temporary pleasure, right? Which is what, she was doing, right? She was getting money to be, very extreme sexually, right? Is, ancient, right? And dates all the way back to some of Christ's original teachings on the nature of sin. And was really, so when I was originally going to talk about St. John Chrysostom at the same time as this stuff, that was actually the passages that we were going to talk about, is that, you generate, basically that sin, it generates, hell on earth. Right, it's not just in the afterlife that you suffer if you're sinful. You're constantly tormented by the awful things that you've done in some way or another. Objectively speaking, even without the idea of Christ in your life, right? So the hell that she is now experiencing, right, is entirely her decision. And, the sad part is that her sense of public shame really only extends enough to cover her career in hardcore, extreme pornography, right? Earlier in the episode, and I didn't include it, because it was just kind of dumb. She defends pornography as a whole. And I kind of talked about, I said the ethical pornography, the idea that, if the woman chooses, everything about it and there's no agent, suddenly makes it so that there's no pressure, right? And there's no bad side to it. And the sad part, the sad reality, is that, those poor women who do that are going to find out that, they've also exhausted themselves in the sexual marketplace. And there is no fidelity with anybody that, they want to have a relationship with in the future because they've sold themselves for money, right? So, they're worth that, that tiny, tiny value, by comparison of what they would be worth, a man to, sacrifice himself right at a job every day to support, like if you're comparing those two, right? Um, and later in the episode, right, which it actually wasn't very long after this, that she advertises a sex toy for her podcast sponsor. So she's clearly not out of the hole yet. I mean, and maybe that's being a little bit judgmental, right? Because it's like, what options does she really have to get her story out? Maybe that's kind of the limit of her ability to, speak freely on the topic, right? And still get sponsored, and still have, any kind of a lifestyle, right? So, I mean, it's kind of a weird, right? Because the moment you start really being honest about it and talking about all of the awful effects of all of that feminist ideology, no one wants to sponsor you. There's a reason I'm not putting my name on this stuff, right? It's because, I mean, they want to silence you. They want as many young women participating in this stuff as possible, right? So I mean, I kind of get it, and maybe it's important to be empathetic to that as well, right? But the big thing, it's really important to be human, right? And to empathize with the fact that, ultimately she was lied to, right? And she was manipulated, by our enemies, by people who want to, wipe us off the face of the earth, right? People who want to eliminate us. And the structure that we are supposed to put in place, that was supposed to protect her and supposed to guide her, right, failed. And it failed totally, and it failed her, and all of her friends and stuff like that. It was a spectacular failure, right? And what's worse is that, we capitalized on it in a lot of ways, right? At the time she was producing Pornography was long before, I ever thought anything negative of pornography. That was long before any of my friends ever thought anything negative of pornography, right? So it's like we capitalized on this. We let ourselves be, sexually pleasured, by, her destroying herself, right? And, in the end goal, or not the end goal, but, the end result here is that, her dreams of being a wife and a mother are forever gone. And, she knows it. And she knows it. And that's the reality of it, right? And she kind of talked about that a little bit, when I was married and when I wanted kids. She knows that it's not that she doesn't want kids, right? She still has the biological pull, right? It's that it's unattainable. And that's partly why she's suicidal, right? It's also true, I mean, she hasn't escaped that toxic environment, so that's, we just talked about that, right? That's another reason to be empathetic. But, she's trapped by her past, right? And, as much as it's her fault, the truth is that, she was conned into doing it, right? And it never should have happened, and I mean, had she been, let's say that, porn was illegal and she did her first shoot and she was thrown in jail, and that was it. That would be exponentially better than, that would already be bad. That would already be horrible. It's already, just like, a destruction of the family, right? To behave in this way, but it's like, it's that much worse that it got to build and build and build and, just all the awful, degenerate things that she took part in, right? That now screwed her over, and completely ripped her future away. And, ultimately, she is still in this position. She's still in that, that phase where, she thinks that, if we just change the game a little bit, if people just accepted me, that she would find her way out. And that's because there's no masculine influence, right? There's no masculine role model. There's nobody manly there to tell her the truth and to be like, no, and to, just tolerate her screaming and crying and being upset and saying, no, that's not, none of this is true. This is all bullshit, right? And, the sad part, the really sad takeaway from this is that, she is another victim, just another of the many, nameless faces, right, that, suffered and are, in a lot of ways irredeemable. They're gone, they're lost, right, in this long war, right, that is consuming everything of beauty and vibrancy in our culture. And in its place, turning everything into a barren corporate hellscape. That's really the end game here, right? Is that, because it's really sad, because, she's really pretty. Like, she would have made someone really happy, but she can't, forever. She, all of that, that potential that she had to bring to the table, to take a family man and to give him a lot of kids, and to, really, set her culture up, we're not, I guess it's not even like a culture, right? It's just continue on, just a positive, intergenerational, scenario, basically. It's gone. It's wiped out. That little shred of life, of positive energy, right, is just gone. It's been used up. It's been consumed, right? And that's really where we're all kind of guilty in that, is that it's consumed and we consumed it. Um, but what's really unfortunate here, there's obviously a lot of unfortunate shit here, right? But what's really unfortunate here is that, these poor girls associate her sense of shame with rejection from the elements of society that have some sense of normalcy to them still. When they're talking about the woman, right? It's, oh, well, she, was calling the cops on me. It's like, if she accepted me, it would have been so much better. And it's like, their mindset is that, when the lifeblood of the country and the culture abandons their morality, they'll feel accepted. That they'll feel better, that the suicidal thoughts will go away. And the reality is that, her past will always exclude her from, biologically, right, from any high quality male for a long-term prospect, because she can never be exclusive or faithful to her husband. Footage of her being extremely, perverse, right, with other lesser men is out there forever, right? And this, it ties back to that sense of value that's directly tied to a woman's sexual value on the marketplace. And it's the same reason that people in positions of power seek to exploit young women to gain from their willingness to sell it in favor of progression in the workplace. And that's, tapping into that sexual value increases a male's value in the sexual marketplace and inflates their sense of self, right? So basically, going beyond their value in the marketplace, right? There is a personal gain there that's attainable and that's available and that they actively seek, to bolster themselves. And it's totally predatory, right? And I talk about that in here a little bit, right? It's totally predatory, but the reality is that, she's not exclusive, and if she's not exclusive and she's completely devalued herself to anyone except these degenerate predators, right, who are actively trying to consume her, no amount of societal recognition, will make up for her being completely uncompetitive, and that's just a sad reality, right? And she recognizes this subconsciously when she's talking about, the men that her friend set her up with, right, that wound up just, only being interested in fulfilling, their own degenerate fantasies with her body, and soul by extension, right, and nothing further, because there's nothing there, you can't have anything, to, like, there's no sense of sacrifice for it, right? There's no sense of, and that's kind of sad to, just quantify it just to that, right? Because that's not totally true, but, her most intimate parts of her soul and her body, right, are available, and everything else that she has to offer is an extension of that, right? And so if that's out in public and that is, consumed by the masses, then you don't have to put up with her bad days and you don't have to, provide and be competitive, to get her, because you can just go online and you've already got everything that you want, and if you meet her in person, so that it's, okay, so, oh, well, porn isn't the same as having sex. Right. But, at the same time, how much money do they really pay her to perform? Right. So all you have to do is pay her that amount of money and she'll do these, like, ridiculous things. I mean, part of what she was talking about in the clip that I didn't include. Honestly, I mean, if you want to really watch it, go ahead, but it's really nothing noteworthy. So she talks about, like, some dude, like, gagged her to the point where she threw up and then, like, pissed in the cup and made her drink it, as part of the film. And it's like, how much money do you have to pay her? So, okay, so maybe I don't want her to do that, right? Because that's fucking gross, but, like, how much money did she get paid to do that, right? And, proportionally, right, percentage wise, how much of that do I have to pay her, right, to get to the same thing, right? And that's, that's the reason that she's uncompetitive, and that's the sad part. And what's also sad is that, her friend really tries, immediately following that passage, right, tries to really build her up and say, well, in 10 years, you're going to be, you're going to disappear, right, and what else? You're going to disappear and, nobody's going to care and it's going to be normalized. And it's like, well, first off, what will society be like in 10 years when that's normalized? What are you really, do you think that you're going to be worth somebody better? Somebody that you want, because it's normalized, and secondly, like, how is that better that everybody is dealing with that now? How does society keep going? Like, it's just mind numbing, right? And the easy answer to that, right, is like, oh, everybody's gonna forget about it in 10 years, right? Like, what age group are you gonna be dating? Honestly, it's not gonna be the young kids. It's not gonna be the young guys that that don't that they're consuming different levels of degeneracy, right? It's gonna be people in your age group. Because she's not competitive enough to get any of these young kids. It's just, well, they're young kids right now, right? Now I'm not saying like, predator wise, but like young boys that are growing up, that will be, that kind of that competitive age group, right? That she would be wanting to date, in 10 years, right? They don't want her because she's old, and worse, she was an old whore, right? So it's like, they're that much less competitive. So, in conclusion, right, I don't recommend watching this podcast. There really wasn't, I thought there would be a little bit more, and maybe parts of it, I was kind of reaching, I took a lot of what they were talking about, and I originally wanted to talk about, oh, look how sad she is, look how destroyed she is, she's a victim in this war, and it's like, she only regrets certain parts of it, so, I don't know, it's like, it really wasn't that, enlightening, but I don't know, like, there were a couple critical moments, right? And I think I pretty much covered all of them. There were a couple of moments of truth in their experience, and like they're actively, in between those, they're actively participating in this system. Like, so the girl from the first clip, when she was talking about, oh, my boyfriend, she's talking about how she's single and casual dating and, how to flirt with guys and stuff. And it's like, I use it as an example to talk about how, like, how little effort it takes, right? How, because it takes a lot of effort, right, to be that person of value in these people's lives, to carry that influence, right? How little value or how little effort did it take, for her boyfriend at that time, to have that positive influence. Right, and honestly, if he's participating in the system, how positive really is he, right? Like it's such a low bar, but that's kind of the extent of it. They're actively, saying to participate, in all these awful things, that are ultimately killing them. And they advocate for incredibly destructive behaviors, right? Like masturbation and casual sex, and we just talked about that, right? But, the masturbation thing, sitting there talking about breaking her Hitachi or whatever. It's like, well, aren't you upset, about, the way that, why would you continue to perpetuate this? And their concept of philosophy is just like, it's honestly about what you'd expect, from the, burnout thoughts, they're roasties, right? They were competitive at one time, and they're rapidly losing it. They're on the backside of, their, sexual value. They're 24 and up, and they've been, they've been around, right? They've been around with a lot of different dudes, and they're rapidly losing what's left, right? Their surface level sexual value, and basically, they're frustrated, right? These new modern methods of, achieving, happiness, right, have failed completely. They thought, they were talking about this a little bit in the first clip, right, or the second one. They were talking about how, that, well, this glamour, all the glamour, they thought they were going to have this wonderful lifestyle, right? And the one girl originally, she later on in that conversation, it wasn't really like that important, but she talks about how, like because of her dad and because of her mom, she decided, against, pursuing the girls next door lifestyle, right? But it's like otherwise, the casual dating and, the hypersexualized nature and, or was it polygamy? Hypergamy. There we go. There's just like hypersexual all the time. And it's gotten nothing for them, like, and it's really like so it's a YouTube video, right? So if you watch like, so our friend Olivia, right, now is the one who was talking about about her experience at, was it Buffalo Wild? No, Hooters, whatever. She is an incredibly toxic influence, right, on the rest of them, and it's apparent because she looks like a freak. It's like, she's got like this disheveled, schizophrenic, hair is pulled back super tight, her eyeballs are just fucking open. She is just like locked on, and it's always, this back and forth between, dopamine and adrenaline, right? And you could tell that it's just eroded her receptors, in her brain. And it's like, just back and forth with this fight or flight and, happiness, right? The just one way or another, extremes. And you can tell it's just like, she's not okay. She is just fucking nuts. So, when you're listening to her, like, you got to realize that, that's, the psychological tips, the philosophical tips, I guess, you're going to get, from this chick, are from someone who has just burned themselves out, right? But, that being said, I mean, there is a lot of value, in underlying, right? The underlying themes, that have specifically related to stuff that I've talked about in the past and stuff that's kind of gaining a little bit more traction, and that's, we can apply it, right? How do we handle our families? How do we handle our communities, especially as men, right? And why is it so incredibly important for us to be involved as a positive presence, even a passive positive presence, right, in the lives of the people around us? I mean, it doesn't take a real level of intimacy, to just be stable, right? And just be a crutch for the community to lean on, when they are, propositioned by this stuff. And, it's not like an active, like you're in their face saying, no, you fucking idiot, right? It's just this passive, just there, that pillar of society, prevents a lot of this stuff, right? And if nothing else, it, on that same tangent, right, it just goes to show how insanely little effort is required to really drastically influence our neighbors and families. Like, what if there was one positive man in this chick's life? And it's not just positive as in like happy, right? But like a positive influence. What if her uncle was around? Or what if her dad wasn't a piece of shit, right? Or focused on her daughter or whatever. Or what if she had like one good boyfriend, that wasn't, just perpetuating this downward spiral, right? And, trying to, take advantage of it. Things would have been dramatically different, right? And so for her, it was a unique experience because she wound up being the top #1 porn producer. Or not porn, but porn performer, right? But like now with OnlyFans, it's not, these independent, one-offs, right? Because there's only one Lana Rhoades, right? There's a lot of these porn stars, there's only one of them, and they're very unique, that's a very fringe element, right? But with OnlyFans, the 30 million young women, marketing themselves on, these porn sites, I mean, what are they? Ugh, it's so much worse, right? It's so much worse, because now, like I just said, right? There's only one Lana Rhoades, but 30 million young women, there's one in every street. There's one in every neighborhood, right? That are going to go through these same things and want to kill themselves and stuff. And it's like all you have to do to, influence that is just be there, and just say no. Literally all it takes, is a moral foundation, to simply say no, right? And have an opinion when someone presents these disastrous ideas, in a way that's positive, right? And the truth is that duty never really ends, and it extends everywhere. And it's really easy, part of this is libertarian ideology, right? Libertarian philosophy, right? I don't care what you do in the confines of your own home. No, get that shit out. We got to get that shit out of our heads, right? Because this is what happens. And this is what's happening, on every street corner in America pretty much right now. The breakdown of the family, the destruction of the family. This poor young woman is never going to have a wife, a husband and kids, and have any kind of stability. And neither are any of these other chicks. They are destroying themselves. And that directly affects us, because as they destroy themselves, I think it was Joseph Stalin who once said, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic, right? One person doing it is a tragedy. Millions of young women doing this, that's a statistic, right? That is at a macro level. I've talked about this consistently, right? So like, this is nothing new if you've listened to the other like 5 podcasts. On a macro level, this becoming normalized is the end of the family. And the end of the family is the end of civilization, right? And that extends, so like there's this idea that, we can have this new modern family. And it's like, no, the Romans had their concept of family, right? There was a man and a wife, and their kids, and there was a certain hierarchy to it, right? And it wasn't perfect. The Greeks had a man, a hierarchy, and their kids, Polyamorous societies have never succeeded. They're always temporary, they're always violent, and they don't go anywhere, right? It's literally just savages being savages. And, in any civilized nation on earth, there has always been, a monogamous, semi-monogamous, right, family culture. Either monogamous or polygamous to an extent, right? But polygamy is also a really bad alternative for a number of different reasons. Mostly because, now you have a bunch of young men that have no marriage prospects because, only that top percentage of men is going to get married, right? Going to get their wives. And also it incredibly devalues women, right? Which is, a problem ultimately, right? Because if women in the house are devalued, this is kind of what you end up with. It's like half of your civilization is just, fodder. But anyway, so where I was going with that, right, is that, as this stuff breaks down, there's not a new normal that's beyond us. Their utopia doesn't exist. It's just hell. It's just hell. It's just destruction. It's just a bunch of, sociopathic young kids that become adults that have been exploited their entire lives, functioning as these, now they're monsters, right? Now they're predators because that's all they've been taught to be, just like her, right? All she's been taught to be is, nothing positive, right? Nothing constructive. She's continuing to perpetuate the cycle, right? Is kind of where I was going with that. It's the end of that constructive society. And, look at who they blame for this. It's not themselves. She talks about her agent, and this, that, and the other. But look at who they're really vitriolically against. Who are they angry at? It's the woman who wants the porn stars out of her neighborhood. It's the people with morals, right? It's the people with the head on their shoulders that are like, well, I don't want that. I don't want you exploiting yourself. I don't want my kids to think that's okay. I don't want that influence in my society. I don't want the people that you hang out with to come around my home, because this is my house. I don't want my neighborhood to turn into one giant degenerate, sex, show, right? I don't want to live like that. And they're coming for these people is the ultimate reality, right? And she kind of talked about that. They alluded to it a little bit, right? But they're not quite in power yet. They're not quite there yet, but they will be very shortly. That's kind of a scary concept. So, but we're a little bit over an hour. I guess I'd just like to close out. So I was going to talk about St. John of Chrysostom. I think I'll hit that next time. So I guess, I'll leave it with the first passage. Which, ultimately when I started this, I actually just wanted to read. I wanted to create like audiobooks, which that didn't turn out very well because I think I spent more time talking than anything else. But I'll just read the passage and, you can kind of think about it, I guess. And it totally attains exactly to what we were just talking to. So I guess let me give a little bit of the background, right? So this is from the first sermon on Lazarus and the rich man. So the background is that Lazarus, is a poor man, right? And he lives this life of poverty and suffering. It's got like these sores, and dogs are licking the sores, and he's always doesn't even get the table scraps, right? Super, awful lifestyle, just constantly shit on by the world. And despite, his miserable position, he maintains his spiritual integrity and ascends into heaven when he dies. While the rich man, right, so he lives outside this guy's gate, right, and the rich man, who lives inside the gate, who is manipulative and selfish to attain his wealth, doesn't share it all with Lazarus, right, goes to hell. And people have talked about this a lot. Oh, it's communist. Well, it's not really communist, right? It's talking about taking care of your community. It's not saying that you don't deserve to have anything. It's saying that, if you can see someone in front of you struggling and you do nothing to help them, you deserve the hell that they live through, right? And that's, ultimately what happens. But a common, counter, not counter, right? But a common saying among people today is, I'm gonna, YOLO, right? I'm gonna live it up, and everybody's going to hell, and then I get to live, and be pleasurable in this life, and then, afterwards, I, whatever happens, right? And if there's no hell, right? Oh well, then I won double, right? Because well now I don't have a punishment to pay for, and you see a lot of people that are like, well, if I'm right, I suffer on earth and I go to heaven for eternity, and if you're right, you go to hell for eternity, right? And so he kind of talks about that a little bit. So here's the first passage that I wanted to talk about, right? It comes from kind of the end of that first sermon. So he did not say anything like what many people are likely to say. He's talking about Lazarus. That if this rich man, when he departs the other world, receives punishment and retribution, he has made one for one. But if hereafter he enjoys the same honors as here, he has made two for nothing. Do not you ordinary people use these expressions in the marketplace and bring the language of the racecourse into the theater into the church? And the theater into the church. Many people often say these things with a laugh, but even this belongs to the evil methods of the devil, to introduce corrupt teaching into our life in the guise of humorous expressions. Many people use these phrases continually in workshops, in the marketplace, and in their houses. This is a mark of extreme unbelief, of real mania, and of a childish disposition. To say if the wicked are punished when they depart, and not be thoroughly convinced that they surely will be punished, is characteristic of unbelievers and skeptics. If this indeed should happen, and surely it will happen, to think that the wicked will have enjoyed an equal reward with the righteous indicates the height of foolishness, right? So I kind of thought that tied in a little bit. There's one a little bit farther in that's like it almost directly. It talks about living in that constant fear and suicidal ideations, right? And that constant you're judging yourself right after committing these sins. That like directly applies. But I thought that one was pretty good. And it really talks about how humorously people say those kinds of things, right? It's such a and it's not just that, right? It's all of these other things that we let oh well, do you really think that that the some magic dude walked on water and turned water into wine? It's like these humorous expressions, right, that work themselves. It's like a splinter, right? It's like a fiberglass splinter. It's very sharp, but it's very subtle, and it's very flimsy on the surface, right? But man, it just like slices right inside, just like right underneath the skin. And it sets that tone of doubt, right? So anyways, we'll talk about that next time. Again, have a happy Father's Day. If you're a dad, thanks for being a dad. We need more parents, we need more families. So thanks for taking that step, into, continuing on, all of the wonderful parts of our culture, right? And really, kind of setting the tone for the next generation. Right. And if you're not a dad yet, this is a cool time to appreciate all the men who are dads, right? Who are figuring out, how to raise kids in this time the hard way, right? So that when you have kids, in the near future or in the, the short term, right? Short term, medium term, you have references, you have people to look at and be like, well, how am I supposed to do this? How did you handle this, right? Because as things change generationally, the influence of your parents and your grandparents is not always applicable, right? So anyways, that's all I'm going to leave you with. Have a good one, and I will see you next time.